With the 2020 U.S. presidential election pitting two radically different visions against each other, the race to the White House this year is all set to be a watershed moment in the nation's history. Throughout his first term, President Trump has been intent on reshaping American government and refocusing its foreign policy in an unprecedented manner. Now, the whole world is watching which direction the U.S. goes next. So what does the election mean for the U.S. and other countries around the world, especially for this region, Asia-Pacific? Earlier, I had the chance to talk to Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow from the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Here's his take. And I'm joined with honor by Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow from Asia Research Institute with National University of Singapore. Professor Mahbubani, what a pleasure to see you.
Pleasure to be with you again.
Professor Mahbubani, how certain do you think we can be about a smooth process for the U.S. presidential election this year?
Oh, I think we certainly cannot be confident of any kind of smooth process in the U.S. this year because, you know, I've been following the U.S. for clearly almost 50 years now. And this is the most divided, the most polarized, the most troubled United States of America that I have seen in my lifetime. So I think you're seeing a very highly charged political atmosphere in the United States today. And it is, sadly, we are more likely to see a very difficult, challenging outcome rather than a clear country by either Trump or Biden.
Many suggest that this has a lot to do with the divide that has been there with the U.S. Over the past 1 decade or two. Some also suggest that there is a need to have an autopsy, quote-unquote, of the U.S. Election system. So do you think these are necessary? And what do you think are the fundamental problems hidden behind the great divide you've been talking about?
Well, I would use the word autopsy. Autopsy is only done for dead bodies. The United States political body is still very much alive and well and kicking. But certainly something has gone profoundly wrong within American society and in the United States, which used to be a democracy, which is a government of the 100%, by the 100%, for the 100%. And today, United States sadly has become a plutocracy. Plutocracy is the government of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. So the elites in the United States have done very well over the last 30, 40 years. But the bottom 50% in the United States has been going down over a 30-year period. And I think what the United States needs to do is to examine why is it the case that the livelihood of the bottom 50% hasn't gone up. And the simple answer I give is that the United States has become a plutocracy. And I think the more and more the Americans recognize that it has become a plutocracy, the more likely it is they can find a solution to that problem. And so I hope after the elections, there'll be deeper reflections within the American body politic on what has really gone wrong in the United States, because something clearly has gone wrong. It is a very troubled society today.
How much do you think then, Professor, the choices made by the American voters and the electoral system this time will impact the direction of the world?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the election of an American president has a profound impact on the world. And then, for example, maybe we have learned that when President Donald Trump was elected president in November 2016, exactly 4 years ago, he proved to be a very disruptive president. I mean, clearly the erratic trade war that he launched with China has not just damaged China, it has actually damaged the entire East Asian region, and in many ways the whole world, because the whole global economy slowed down as a result of the trade war that President Trump launched. And sadly also, the incompetent management of COVID-19 by the Trump administration has also damaged American society, American economy, and that has also slowed down global economic growth. So it is a fact that it does matter a lot the choice that is made by the United States. And this is why I hope that if, for example, America chooses Joe Biden as the president, and I hope the polls are right and that he's chosen, then you will see a calming effect on the world, because the disruptive actions of the Trump administration will come to a halt.
Professor Mahbubani, some suggest there is an interesting divide also about how within the United States the debate has been and how it is being perceived outside that country. There seems to be also a huge divide between what people perceive America should be like and what the United States now is like.
Yes, I mean, it is a fact. I mean, I'm not giving any secrets away that the standing and prestige of the United States has come down significantly since President Trump was elected president. You can see this in the
and therefore, Professor, is it naive? Is it naivete, some would say, for people from outside the United States expected to be more rational, to be more logical, to be more international, multinational? Is it naive or wishful thinking from outside the country? Of course, the election result will tell us, but still, at this stage,
yes,
it's an interesting question, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. But I think you're absolutely right. And as you know, my very first comment for 50 years, I haven't seen it as divided, as polarized, and as troubled as it is today. But I do believe at the same time that Biden will try his best to try and restore a certain degree of sanity in the American decision-making process. I think there'll be a lot of resistance by the Republicans. A lot depends on, by the way, whether or not the Democrats can win both if they win the presidency, whether or not they can win the House. I think they're likely to keep the House, and whether or not they can also win the Senate. If the Democrats can win the House, the Senate, and have the presidency, then I think you will see a certain ability for the country to come together and fix some serious problems.
On the other hand, what does it mean, the election result of this presidential election in the U.S. For Asia-Pacific region, particularly ASEAN countries, where you are?
And I think, a former Indonesian ambassador to the United States, a friend of mine, his name is Dino Jalal, wrote an excellent article on in the magazine called The Diplomat, saying that he hoped that the Trump administration is noticing that no Southeast Asian country is enthusiastic about these geopolitical contests, which I discussed in my book, As China Won, that the United States has launched against China. He says nobody's enthusiastic about it. The Southeast Asian countries have other priorities. They want to focus on economic development, on social development, and the last thing the Southeast Asian countries want is the continuation of a very disruptive trade war and geopolitical contest that the United States has engaged in under the Trump administration. So I suspect that the ASEAN countries will be quietly happy to see a more stable and predictable administration in Washington, D.C.
There is already some apparent division going on in the Asia-Pacific region, to say the least. For example, Japan, Australia, together with the United States, forming the so-called the Quad. And there were talks about more countries joining in, or desire for more countries to joining in. Those names certainly could include some of the ASEAN countries, as Washington would hope. On the other hand, we also see ASEAN at the time trying to struggle with a right consensus. Professor, what do you make of that? What would this election and the foreign policy direction of the U.S. mean?
Well, I mean, you know, I've been studying geopolitics all my life. And geopolitics is, as you know, the traditions goes back thousands of years. And as you know, our friend Graham Allison's written a book that whenever a new power emerges, the established power tries to push it down. So this is also what I document in my book as China One, which is that as China is emerging and about to surpass the United States is trying to push China down. And that's logical behavior in some ways, and the United States is looking for allies, and so it has tried to use the Quad. But since you focus on ASEAN, I think it is very unlikely, I may be wrong, but it's very unlikely that any ASEAN country will join the Quad. Because from the point of view of the ASEAN countries, it's very important that they have good relations with their most important neighbor. Their most important neighbor with whom they trade the most by far is China. And the ASEAN countries also want to have good relations with the United States. And I think it's very clear that the ASEAN countries don't want to be caught taking sides in this contest. So unlike the members of the Quad, I think you'll find the ASEAN countries will be far more careful and pragmatic in their calculations.
And it's interesting, Professor, you have noticed that both the EU and ASEAN and some of the other players are trying to be this middle ground between two powers, China and the United States. But it takes more than two to tango, I know that, but it also takes the parties involved have the willingness to be supported by others in order to find the common ground. So how do you think this U.S. presidential election will be able to help others to understand whether the parties involved really want the future that you have enthusiastically trying to support them with?
Well, I think a lot will depend, Tianwei, on whether or not Trump wins or Joe Biden wins. If Trump wins, then I'm afraid that you are right. We are likely to see more and more disruptions. And in fact, a leading figure in the West, I cannot quote him, sure, if Donald Trump is re-elected as president, the West is dead. Because, you know, a lot of allies of the United States, especially in Europe, cannot work with a president like Trump who keeps changing. It's very, very difficult. Whereas, by contrast, I think if Joe Biden is elected, you will see the American alliances becoming stronger because Joe Biden is a very traditionalist American politician, and you will find the United States going back to working with its allies in Europe. And the good news about that is that the Europeans will then tell the United States, you have to go back to the Paris Climate Accords, you know. And I think it's good for us if the United States actually comes back into the game on climate change, because the world will be worse off if the United States stays away. So in that sense, the election of a president makes a huge difference on which direction the U.S. will go.
The other thing we have noticed is the two candidates have been using different degrees of so-called blaming China as the campaign strategy. One possibly is much more ardent in using it than the other. Professor Mahbubani, so far, do you think that strategy has worked, both for American voters, if you look at the polls and the priorities of the election issues, and also for the others who are watching the election very closely around the world?
As you know, American policies towards China now enjoy bipartisan support. And what is actually strange is that on everything that President Trump does, the Democrats oppose him except when he can trade war with China, then the Democrats support him. And so there's a bipartisan consensus there. So it is quite natural for both Democrats and Republicans to attack China in the US presidential election. But I would say that China should not listen to what they say in the presidential election. Because the American presidential candidates have a track record of walking away from what they say in the presidential election. So don't listen to what they say in the campaigns. Watch what they do when the campaign is over. But at the same time, it's also clear that both China and the United States have to sit down and negotiate very hard a new understanding between the two powers. And I'm actually optimistic that at the end of the day, if the United States focuses on improving the well-being of its people and China focuses on improving the well-being of its people, then China and the US can cooperate to improve the well-being of their people. And that's what we should try to achieve after this presidential election race is over.
I want to move on about some subjects that are related to China-US relations and also probably related to the policy tools the new coming president of the US, whether it's one or the other, could work on, for example, about technology, for example, about trade policy, for example, about multilateral platforms. So how do you see, Professor, if you were giving advice to a president who might be listening to advice, what would you say about these areas?
Well, I would say each of these issues, trade, technology, multilateral institutions, each has got its own dynamic. And on trade, it's very clear that the United States will be better off if it engages in more trade rather than less trade with the East Asian region. And as you know, the 21st century will be the Asian century. I've been predicting this for 30 years now. So, if the United States walks away from Asia, it is damaging its economy. On technology, you will see. I don't have good news on technology. I have bad news that the technological competition will become more fierce, because the United States is very frightened that if it loses its technological edge, then it will fall behind. So the United States will fight very, very hard to keep its technological edge, because that's ultimately the most powerful weapon that the United States has. But on multilateral institutions, I'm more hopeful. I think since China is the #1 trading power in the world by far, it is in China's interest to see the United States come back to the World Trade Organization, and European Union, ASEAN, Japan. Everybody wants the United States to come back and engage the World Trade Organization.
Professor Kishore Mahbubani, as always, what a pleasure. Thank you for sharing your insights.
Thank you.